This is House Planning Help episode 175. Hello, I'm Ben Adam Smith, and this is the podcast for you if you're interested in self-build, because I'm exploring what houses we should be building in the 21st century and trying to break down the major roadblocks that may get in our way. Coming up, it's another episode on my own project, and I sit down with Chris Parsons, the boss from Parsons Whittley, to review everything we've done so far, from initial designs through to submitting our planning application. And this will be useful if you've got confused, because we've broken this up into pieces, and I can understand how the process may not make sense. So we'll add in some detail too, and get to that shortly. I try to stay positive. Despite Brexit, I would much rather have stayed part of Europe and still secretly hope that there's some way back. And Trump, the bigger picture, just deleting all the climate change research and stepping away from that and drilling in the Arctic, all of those sorts of things. Sometimes it feels far removed, doesn't it? We don't have an impact. However, when things change on your doorstep, I might mention this from time to time because it just upsets me, front gardens being ripped out for parking spaces. Yes, I understand why people are doing it. They will get more value for their homes and it makes life easier. But I don't like it. We coped beforehand, didn't we? And then there are back gardens that get paved over for easy maintenance and fence panels instead of hedges for immediate privacy. And probably even on my own project, I have to have some fence panels, but I would far rather have a nice hedge there growing. For me, though, the kryptonite is plastic plants, fake topiary. It just insults me as a gardener. It's one of my hobbies. I like gardening. And to think that these plastic plants just get put up, when what you could do is just not have them. Have a house without plastic plants. I think that is a far better approach. Anyway, I tell you all of this because of a visit to what I thought was my local garden centre. I normally go to a different one. This one was closer, so I needed to get some plants for the front of the house because we're about to move, and I thought it would just be nice for the new people who've bought the house to come in, and they've got some brand new marigolds on the outside, something warm and bright, just to invite them in. And I got into this garden centre and was looking around. Yes, they've got the barbecues, the garden furniture, the loungers, but they just seem to have a lot of fake flowers in there and plastic. I'm sure it's not all made of plastic. And I went round, I thought, right, so it's not down here. And I was just doing this tour around the building, think, where are the plants? And obviously the boss of the place or one of the workers there could see that I was confused. And I just said, do you have any plants here? And he went, nope, no plants here. And I just felt really awkward and there was a tension in the air. I imagine this wasn't the first time that it's happened to him. But it was just really strange. This whole place, it looked like a garden centre because there was so much colour and everything. But it just felt a bit, I don't like this around here. Where are the real plants? And I think that that's what really gets my goat when it comes to fake plants, is they're not the same thing. They don't change with the seasons. They don't die if you don't look after them. Plants are living things. And so when people try and just use plastic plants to just pretend everything's perfect, I don't know, maybe there is a case for it. I just wanted to share that story with you because, yeah, that drilled right down into me when I saw that. I just thought, no, I'm sure this used to be a garden centre with plants all around. Let's get to our featured interview today. It's with Chris Parsons, who is the boss of architecture firm Parsons Whittley. Kay and I have been working with him and the team for almost 4 months now. And last time round, if you checked out episode 174, we focused on how we might address some of the planning constraints, including the height of the building. What I want to do today is just recap all the steps that we've been through, add in a little more detail, and I just think that this will be useful to bookend this part of the process. I started by asking Chris what happened after our initial 2-hour meeting.
So following taking the brief from yourselves, really, and trying to understand what it was you were looking for, the first stage really is very, very sketchy, literally pencil sketches of some ideas to just try to see how the whole brief comes together, bearing in mind all of the other constraints that we're trying to work with. So we're looking for a simple form factor. For example, the site itself has got quite a lot of constraints in terms of it's quite constrained as to where we can put the place, where we can put the building. It's quite constrained in terms of, therefore, the orientation, etc. So in our heads, we're working through how do we reconcile those constraints. We've got some opportunities. We've got some nice views. We want to capture all of those. And actually, we go into some three-dimensional software called SketchUp, which enables us to just pull some shapes about and try to find a form that works against all of those constraints and opportunities.
Well, you've mentioned SketchUp. Is that what the building is designed in total, or once you've got sketches, oh, this is nice, then it goes onto another piece of software?
Yeah, that's correct. We start designing in SketchUp because it's really easy to get some 3D forms out there quite quickly. You can position it in the real world, so we can have a look at shadows, we can have a look at how it works in terms of orientation. And it's actually easy for a layperson to understand. The sort of models that come out of SketchUp are really quite easy to get people to immediately comprehend what we're talking about. And we stay in SketchUp right the way through to planning. Some people perhaps would go earlier than planning. They might go to a more technical design. We actually will use SketchUp right the way through the planning process. But you're quite right. Once we've got through that process, we need to take that into some software which gives us the ability to demonstrate more technical detail.
So the first sketches that we got back, we thought it was quite interesting that actually a lot of it was pretty much what we'd hoped for. We liked the form, we liked the aesthetic, and there was a bit of jiggling around downstairs, thinking about layouts, how we'd live in the kitchen and so forth, exactly what you'd expect. So we fed back to John, and that was all good. And then we moved on to the materials, which that really surprised me, that you could have the sketches which don't really specify a material, yet as soon as you have material, it takes on a different identity. I sound silly saying this, but
I don't think you're silly at all. We deliberately, in those first sketches we sent you, we took materials off because materials can make a significant impact on how the building is going to look. So, as I just mentioned, we're trying, in the first instance, to isolate the form. So, actually, we had some ideas about materials in those first sketches. We quite liked the idea maybe of some boarding, some dark boarding. We quite liked the idea of brickwork. And yet when we put those onto our SketchUp model before we sent them to you, we felt it might be trying to get you to commit at a step too far. So we deliberately took the materials off the sketch and sent you that so we could just get to form. What then happened, of course, is that you came back and we had a little bit of playing around with plans, etc., exactly as we would expect to do. And then we started to add some materials. And that proved for us probably the slightly more challenging thing, because you could then see a little bit more about the impact of those materials. And we had a little bit of toing and froing, didn't we, about trying to find the right material balance for what we were trying to do.
Yeah, we looked at brick and the barn aesthetic as well, sort of black weatherboard, and felt that was a bit strong. I think Kay was after slightly lighter colours and so forth, and so that came back towards this rendered look. But this was actually at the same time as, were we trying to address height issues? I suppose maybe we should rewind a step, that when we first looked at what we could build, were you just coming up with, doesn't matter where it would be, or were you considering a lot of the constraints?
We were considering all of the constraints. I think that's actually, I would like to say that's probably the skill, if you like, the essential skill of an architect, is to be able to have all those constraints and opportunities in his head and still produce something that kind of addresses 90% of them. We'll never get them all in the first tranche. And then you remodel to get to the last few and try and iron those out. So, no, that was really something that was going on very early on. But one thing that we were also doing at the same time as we've done that first sketch, that form without the materials, we started at that stage as well to send that through to the planners and see if we could get a response from them. And it was actually a comment that came back from them about, we'll need to be quite careful about height because of the relationship with the neighbour. And you'd mentioned this as well. So that had come back from the planning side, and then there was a discussion which came back from you as clients saying that you would like to look at perhaps breaking up the materials, using some slightly different materials across the facade, which for us meant breaking down the facade into different elements, because we don't believe you can just put materials on without some justification, some background to it. So that's when we started to think about, can we use different elements to reduce height and prevent overshadowing and overlooking for the neighbour, and also to address your concerns about the sort of the mass of the building all in one material.
I think in some ways we might have taken you off down a path that wasn't entirely necessary, but it's learning for us too that those materials, for example, it couldn't be done like that. I didn't know that before, so that's interesting that that's an architectural point there. And then we developed a couple of different things going on in the building on that latest iteration, where it was a step down, which, to be honest, that was always what I imagined we might end up having. And then also something going on at the back of the building was another way of doing this. So maybe you can just describe those two approaches and how, we can include these in the show notes of, again, how we were looking at the design evolving.
So following the idea of different materials and breaking it down into different elements, we realised that we could probably start to use a larger element at one end of the site and break it down into smaller elements down towards the garage. That would address some of the issues we had about overshadowing of the neighbour, and it also gave us the opportunity to introduce different materials. However, at the same time, it started to introduce a degree of complexity that we probably didn't want to do, and I think subsequently we probably found out that you didn't want to do either. So you're probably quite right. We were probably chasing something that neither of us really wanted. And it's quite interesting because it caused us quite a lot of head scratching, I suppose, in the office with with John coming up with some ideas and me coming up with some ideas as to how we could break these elements down, introduce different materials and address those issues. And it wasn't until we then probably came back to you with various suggestions and we eventually decided to have a meeting that we actually brought all of that stuff back together and sort of got to a reasonable resolution.
So what we worked through in that session was trying to bring back a simpler form, but still we had some issues that we needed to make sure that the amenity for the neighbours was not reduced. So maybe let's start, what do we need to protect for the neighbour?
Well, it's always important, I think, when designing a building that you appreciate and understand the amenity for the neighbour. So there's no such thing really as a right to a view, and there's not much in terms of a right to light. However, the planners aren't going to approve something that seriously impacts on the amenity and the enjoyment of the neighbour. So it's important to always develop a scheme that doesn't do that doesn't have any adverse impact on the neighbours and the surrounding area. So we were very keen to try to keep the roof lower than we had shown on the original sketch, and one of the tricks, if you like, one of the things that we did was to break the roof line across the back, which enabled us to pull the ridge down and put a small cat slide element across the lesser status rooms at the back. That reduced the ridge height. Then we could reposition the house slightly further away than the earlier consent, and again that reduced the amount of overshadowing and kept the same kind of view of the sky, which is another element we look at for the neighbour. So I think once we'd done that, we realised we could get back to a simple form again, and then we could explore how that worked in terms of materials.
And this brings us up to getting quite satisfied with, I felt I know why this building is looking like it's looking at. I like the materials. We didn't talk too much about construction type. Is that because it's not really relevant at this stage?
Yeah, it's not really relevant at this stage. I think in planning terms, we're looking at the form, the scale, the mass. That's the first thing, as we've already discussed. Then we start to apply the appropriate materials. Now, materials need to be decided upon along the lines of what's the appropriate material for the setting, for the location, because we don't want this to look alien in its setting. So it's a question of understanding what are the local vernacular in terms of materials. It's also a question of understanding what you as a client like, what type of material you like. There's issues around maintenance and longevity. So all of those things really are the next step. Let's work out what finishes we're going to apply to the outside. But we believe in honesty in architecture. So if we're going to have a masonry finish, for example, bricks or in this case render, we really want it to be honestly applied. For myself, then, the next decision is how are we going to build it? What construction shall we use? There's always the initial discussion, should it be timber frame or should it be masonry? That's probably where we start with lots of our stuff. For me, I actually quite like masonry. I like the thermal mass that it provides. And you wanted a rendered finish. And actually, it's quite interesting that Kay picked up on wanting this soft lime rendered finish. And to do that properly, I felt that it would be easiest, most cost effective to apply that to a masonry external skin. We've done cavity wall construction passive houses before. So from all of those things probably has led us now to thinking we're going to build this as a masonry cavity wall building.
And knowing the texture that Kay likes, and I like, is that really represented by the material that the render is put on top of?
The thing about render is what we have learned. We can do render. We can do these very thin polymer modified renders straight on top of insulation. And we've done a lot of passive houses like that. One of the things we've begun to understand is that they tend to promote mold growth rather quicker than we would like. There are reasons, technical reasons for that, which I won't go into now. But as a consequence, I'm not now a great fan of using a thin polymer modified render on external wall insulation. And also you wanted that soft limey texture, which you don't get with these renders. So again, it needed for me something fairly solid to put it onto. So yep, for me, put it onto a block. The whole external skin then has a thermal mass of its own. It reduces this night sky radiation and reduces the potential for this mold growth.
Are we likely to get some? You talked to us about washing, or is that not so likely now?
You're going to get some. I think all renders have a tendency to retain a little bit of moisture, particularly on the north side of buildings where the sun doesn't dry it out. And that, just staying on that surface, might encourage some mold growth. So, yep, you're going to have to do a little bit of cleaning. And with a lime render, where we're probably going to treat it with a sort of a lime wash or a silica-based paint of some sort, that will want redecorating on a periodic basis as well. Actually, probably the redecoration is going to be all you need to do, because that will keep it clean in itself.
Gotcha. So that's probably straying a little bit off where we were. We were coming up to planning, and then we had this issue that we were thinking we could get further towards the greenbelt and where the greenbelt actually went. So how did you clarify that, first of all, of where that greenbelt line went?
So we always knew that the large part of your site was in the greenbelt. And I think we realised as we were starting now to prepare, we got through the main design process. So now we're trying to prepare a planning application. So I'm thinking now like a planner. What are they going to ask me? What do I need to demonstrate within all of the documents we're going to submit? And it occurred to me that actually, in order to help the planners make sure that we weren't straying into the greenbelt, it would be a really good idea to mark on the plans the precise limit of the greenbelt. That proved slightly harder to get hold of than I anticipated. But I did eventually manage to get a copy of the greenbelt area, which we then just copied onto our drawings so that I could see where it ran. Because actually we had been slightly confused because there was a boundary that's been moved on the neighbouring property. So once we'd positioned that green belt properly, we decided that we would definitely not stray into the green belt, even though some of the earlier consents have slightly done so. We just felt politically it's going to be a whole lot easier if we don't go into a green belt. Green belts, as you know, politically at the moment, are pretty interesting. So we thought we'd stay right outside it, but we'll come right up to the edge of it, because we want this compromise to get the house as far away from the neighbour as we can and give you as much private garden at that side as we can, but at the same time not cause planning problems by straying into that green belt.
You've got your mindset of what do the planners need to be looking for. Is there anything else that you were keen to submit?
Yeah, we did quite a lot of work in terms of a shadow study. One of the beauties of SketchUp is we've got this 3D model which we can position in the real world, so we can set a date, we can set a time, we can turn on the sun, we can see where the shadows go. So we always do that at the equinox period, so the spring and autumn equinox are about the same, so we can demonstrate where shadows are likely to fall. We did that, and we could demonstrate that actually there was no overshadowing of the neighbour. And the other thing we did was we developed a cross-section which actually showed the extant consent, actually all three previous consents on the site, and what we were now proposing, and we're able to compare each with each so that we could demonstrate that there's no significant overshadowing to the neighbour.
We're also not submitting a new application because we've got full planning permission. So what are we doing? So
what we're proposing to do is to submit what's called a Section 73 application, which is simply to vary the approved drawings for the extant consent. Now there's a tactical reason for doing that. We are building very close to the green belt. I don't want to introduce into that planning process the principle of can we or can we not have a house in this location. That has already been established in your previous consent. So what I'm proposing to do is ask the planners if I can simply substitute the drawings of the previous consent for the drawings that we are now proposing. That doesn't bring into play the whole principle of can we have a dwelling there. It simply allows the planning officer to determine, is this dwelling that I'm now presented with acceptable in planning terms, rather than revisit the whole policy issue of can I have a house there.
Is this quite common?
It's become more so because there's been some changes in legislation which actually requires planning departments now to list the drawings that they've approved, and that makes it slightly easier to approach it down this route by simply seeking to change the approved drawings rather than to revisit the whole policy. It depends whether or not we would use it, because sometimes there might be something that's quite significantly different about this application from the previous one, such that it's not really appropriate to go down that route.
We obviously don't want to speculate at this stage, but what would the timescales be like for a decision? And could it be a grey decision? Can they say, well, yes, you can have this, but...
No, they can't really do that. First of all, the timescale question, it's an 8-week period. The planners are required to make a decision within 8 weeks from the date of validation. We're not yet validated, and some local authorities can take a few weeks to do that, others just simply a few days. But once there is a valid application made, the planners are supposed to make that decision within 8 weeks. Most planning authorities get about 90 to 95% of decisions through in that period of time. Sometimes if it needs to go to a committee, then that cycle might be extended, but they can only do so with our permission. And the reason for that is that we have the option, if they can't make a decision within 8 weeks, to appeal to the Secretary of State against non-determination. Not a process I'd recommend, because it'll probably take us 6 months to get through it. So we will be giving them a bit of extra time if they ask for it. But we should have a decision in around the 8 to 10 week period.
So it sounds like it'll be a yes or no. And if it's a no, can we try all over again, or are we not allowed to try this route, or how would that work?
So if it's a no, because you asked the question, will it be a grey decision? It's not really a grey decision. It will either be a yes or a no, but it might be a yes with conditions. And some of those conditions we might not be ever so happy about. So there is a sort of a grey area in there somewhere. But to deal specifically with your question, if they decide to refuse it, they must refuse it on planning grounds. We would need to look at what those planning grounds are, and we would advise you on the best way to proceed. Now, sometimes it may be that we can simply amend this design, change the design to satisfy what the planner's concerns were, and we can resubmit. We can resubmit that application, and generally within 12 months for the same type of application, there's not a planning fee to pay. So resubmission is probably the best thing to do if we've had a refusal. If we think there's really nowhere to go, then there is the appeal route. You can appeal to the Secretary of State, but it's a 6 to 9 month process, so it's something we really want to try to avoid. But in truth, if we're doing our job properly, we will stay in contact with that planning officer, particularly in the last 3 or 4 weeks of the 8 week period, and we'll be speaking to him. If he's got an objection, something that's troubling him, we will either try to amend it there and then, or if we don't have time, we have the ability to withdraw that application, make the changes and resubmit it. So we'll stay in touch and we nurse the whole thing through the process.
And then just finally, maybe looking at what would be the next steps after this. Don't want to go too far ahead, but should we be preparing ourselves for what next? So
the next steps really are to start developing technical design. We've already done a PHPP model. I should have mentioned that earlier.
Oh, yes. So what did you do that on? Is just that on the spreadsheet, PHPP?
Yep. It's a straightforward PHPP model, making some assumptions because we haven't finalised, maybe which windows we're going to use yet or which MVHR we might be using. But we'll make some basic assumptions and run it through to make sure that this can be a passive house. And we've done that. We'll always try to get the primary space heating demand, down to 13 kilowatt hours at this stage. Give myself a little bit in the back back pocket because you know the limit is 15, and that's what we've done. So I've submitted the verification sheet to the planners so that I can support the argument that this is going to be a passive house. But from there now we can start to do the technical design. Now I would normally recommend that we wait until we're through the planning process, because if something should go wrong with that planning process, you don't want to have paid our fees for doing all the technical design. But the next step really is, as we get towards the end of the planning process, we can start to assess, well, shall we get started now on getting some of this technical design done? And that's when we will decide exactly how we're building it. We'll want to know what windows we're putting in there. We'll be coming back to you to ask for lots more information about what type of doors do you want, what type of ironmongery, skirtings and things like that, so that we can start to produce a tender package to get out to the market for pricing purposes.
Well, Chris, once again, always fun to chat. Thank you for just reviewing all of that and allowing me to just put my finger on a few bits of that process that I don't think I've talked about.
Okay, it's been a pleasure.
Head online to take a look at the show notes that accompany this session, houseplanninghelp.com/175. You can review the key points. Also, if you have a comment or perhaps a question you'd like to ask, just scroll down to the bottom of the show notes. There's a place to do it there. We'll link you across to Parsons and Whitley, and also where you can find Chris on Twitter, houseplanninghelp.com/175. Let's finish up on a hub update, and we're adding a new video this week, which feels quite significant. Goodbye, concrete. We have our in-depth video case studies for hub members, and the idea of this is really to follow the decision-making process and some of the things that are happening on site, because you learn so much as you go through a build. Think grand designs, just focus not on drama, but on decisions. So we had our first case study, which is with Alex Baines. It's built with insulated concrete formwork. It's called Long Barrow. So a lot of emphasis on concrete. And then our next one, Buckinghamshire Passive House, which is built with two different systems. The basement is built with concrete, and then it's got the timber frame PH15 system above. So obviously the start of the project is with the basement and all the concrete again. So now we are moving on to timber. And it's very exciting for me because I've never seen this before. It's a timber frame system where the insulation is going to be blown in towards the end, and it goes fast. They put it up very, very quickly. I think they switched over at the beginning of this year, and I think you're going to enjoy the episodes that we've got coming. Great crew as well. Ben's team, Wayne, Ad, Stu, Matt, and various others who pop in for odd days. So we'll add that to the hub. We've also got the modules, which is the step-by-step learning, the progress calls. This month, we've got special guest Elron Burrell, who's checking in. Can't wait for that one. Private forum as well. If you want to get yourself on the VIP early bird list for when we open the doors again for the hub, this will be after the relaunch of the technical side and the new features we're adding. houseplanninghelp.com/join. Next time we have a case study for you, and I check out Dennis and Nicola Merrigan's self-build, so I hope you can make that one. Thanks for listening. The House Planning Help podcast is produced by Regen Media, content that matters.